Welcome back to another episode of the Home Turf Podcast. I am your host for today, Jordan Epp, the head sports editor here at the Battalion, and we are at Florida week. We are almost done with the season. Super excited about not excited about how the season's gone, but I'm super excited that I've gone to, kind of go through this entire process. And today we got on another great guest, Topher Adams. Tell the people about yourself a little bit.
Howdy, new friends. My name is Topher. I'm the beat reporter for the Independent Florida Alligator, which is the student paper at the University of Florida. I've been covering Florida football and some other Florida sports for the past couple of years, and really excited to talk today about Saturday's game.
Yeah, I'm super excited about the game. We got another game at Kyle Field, back-to-back games after about 42-day hiatus away from A&M football back in the Mecca, but we are here. Now, before we get started on episode 22 of the Home Turf Podcast, I will go into a quick little ad read because this episode, as always, is sponsored by Hitch. So for all your ride sharing needs, make sure you check out Hitch. If you're needing to travel across the state, it's like Uber, but it's for longer distances. For 30% off your first 4 rides, up to $50 each ride, use code AggieNews3. That's spelled AggieNews 3. Now, thanks again to Hitch for sponsoring this episode, and let's go ahead and get into Florida week, okay? Now, before I get started, I wanted to kind of reflect on our seasons because I think Florida and A&M have had somewhat similar seasons and kind of the way it's been a little bit of a roller coaster. So I have a little challenge for you. Describe Florida season in 5 words.
All right. Florida season in 5 words. All right. It's going according to plan. Now, that sounds a little odd because, 4-4, the fans are riled up and all that jazz. But really, when you kind of look at it with full proper context, I think this is kind of where most rational Florida fans and media people kind of expected the Gators to be at this point. They lost something like 5 straight games to close last season. A lot of really good players transferred out, like Tyron Hopper at Missouri, a really good linebacker. He left the program. Kyrie Elam, first-round pick, he left the team. So a lot of really good players left. Dan Mullen's recruiting was not quite Florida standard. So there's a lot of holes in certain areas of the roster. And when you look at the schedule, number 1 Tennessee, number 3 Georgia, ranked Kentucky, ranked Utah, top 10 LSU. Those are all games, 1 win, 4 losses. It's disappointing, surely. But when you look at where Florida is and the schedule they played, I think it's fair to say this is kind of the season we expected. Not like a great overachieving season, not super disappointing. Just, this is about right. This is kind of where you kind of expected the Gators to be at the end of the day.
All right, I got 2 more little season in review games for you. I did this last week when I had on someone for the Ole Miss podcast. But what's the vibe check in Gainesville? How is the community feeling about Florida season?
I feel like tense. Tense is a good word for right now, just like the last 7 to 8 days. Because really, Georgia, you get blown out by your biggest rival. It's expected. They're a great team, but still disappointing. And then really that press conference. Actually, no, let me back it up for a second. Because Thursday, number 2 overall player in the high country class, 2023 recruiting class, Cormani McLean, he was like a Florida lock pretty much for the last couple months. He decides to go to Miami last second. That has people heated. Then they get blown out by Georgia. Then the tension's really high in the press conference afterwards. Then starting linebacker Brenton Cox, he gets dismissed from the team on Monday. Just had another player enter the transfer portal today. It's very uneasy right now. It's very difficult week, not a very happy week, I would say, for Florida fans. But, plenty of opportunity to kind of right the ship, both on the field and in the recruiting world, definitely.
I hadn't heard about that recruiting story, but you mentioned flipping from Florida to Miami. That'll get to my last little season in review thing. I want you to power rank the 3 major Florida schools: Florida, Florida State, and Miami. How have the seasons gone?
All right, so we're just looking at 2022 on the field football seasons.
This season.
Okay. Number 1, far and away, I think, Florida State. Very good, very capable win against LSU. I know the circumstances of that win is incredibly weird, but they still beat a very good SEC team. I think they're like 5-3 on the season. I expect they'll probably win 7-8 games depending on the bowl game. That's a good team. Then I'll go Florida, decent middle of the pack, maybe bottom of the pack SEC team. Got some dudes, got some holes, decent team. And then Miami, uh, Miami's a football team, all right. They
They're in the
won.
mud right now.
They won like my favorite football game that has ever happened with the 14-12 no touchdown classic against Virginia last weekend in quadruple overtime. They turned the ball over 8 times against Duke the week before. Yeah, on the field, Miami is something else, man.
Yeah, Miami's been interesting to say the least. It makes me feel bad because I was on the Miami hype train to start the season and everything's just kind of blown up over there. Now, let's kind of turn this back towards Florida, but let's go ahead and look at the offense because I think that that's kind of where a lot of the focus tends to be with this Florida team. But I'm gonna bury the lead here on who most people are going to want to talk about when they talk about Florida football. Let's start off with what I think is probably the best unit on the Florida team, and that's probably the offensive line, especially in the run game. So, you got players like Osiris Torrance, who's played really well, Austin Barber, kind of speak on how the offensive line has been able to kind of pave the way for Florida as a team so far this season.
Yeah, that's a very astute take from you. Florida's offensive line, probably the strength of the offense, probably the strength of the team, just full stop. Billy Napier, he talks a lot about how much they prioritize the offensive line. And I don't know if they're the only or just one of the only. They have 2 full-time game day coaches whose primary responsibility is the offensive line. Because offensive coordinator Rob Sale was the line coach for the New York Giants last year. He's in, and then they have another offensive line coach whose name is just escaping me right now. So they really are invested in building up the front 5 and bringing in Osiris Torrance from Louisiana. I think Pro Football Focus has him as the highest rated offensive guard in the country. You mentioned Barber, who's been really, really good, kind of in his first season getting playing time. Left guard Ethan White is a very, very good run blocker. Just really good, I think you talk about their run blocking, it's very good. Their pass protection outside of the Georgia game, which, it's Georgia, you're going to have to deal with some pressure. Outside of that game, their pass protection's been really, really good. So really all 5 guys, plus, they have a couple other guys who get into the game as well. Really, really strong unit. And, with Rob Sale and what they're doing, they got some good recruits too at that position. I think Florida definitely going to be an offensive line program under Billy Napier now and into the future.
I think you mentioned Billy Napier specifically kind of to emphasize the offensive line. Look back at what he did in its previous stop. You have NFL players like Robert Hunt, Max Mitchell, Kevin Dotson, and then you have athletic running backs like Elijah Mitchell that came in. And so you've seen a lot of Louisiana Lafayette success in the NFL coming from Billy Napier's previous stop. I mentioned athletic running backs. I think that's the other thing I want to then pivot to for the Florida team. You've got Montrell Johnson, you've got Trevor Etienne, yes, younger brother of Travis Etienne, the running back for the Jacksonville Jaguars. Kind of talk a little bit about, what does each of those running backs provide, and what could people who are from A&M like trying to figure out what to expect from Florida this upcoming weekend expect to see from the running game?
Yeah, I don't want to be too cliche and call them like a thunder and lightning duo, but that's sort of accurate. From day one, I think Montrell, he's a true sophomore who transferred in from Louisiana. And if you told me that guy signed in the Sun Belt, I wouldn't believe you. That dude, he's very big, super strong. He's got a little bit of breakaway speed to him. From day one, he's been the best running back, I think, on campus. And he started himself as like the lead back. But ETN, man, he played like some occasional packages to start the year. At this point, he might just be the most talented like skill position player Florida has. He's a super dynamic runner. He's got amazing hips, amazing vision, especially for a young guy. He's also the kick returner. He can shake things loose in that area of the game as well. Just a really, really exciting all-around back. He can make explosive plays, make physical plays. He can catch the ball. ETN's like at this point, like I still love Montrell and think he does so much just as a complete like runner of the football. But ETN, like that's a player that every fan in the SEC is going to get to know a lot about in the next 3 seasons.
And I mean, Gainesville, Jacksonville, kind of could you compare him to his brother, kind of what you've seen him kind of taking over a little bit in the NFL? Do you think he plays similarly to his brother, or do you think he provides something slightly different?
I think that's like a fair comp. When I think of big ETN, especially, thinking back to the Clemson days, like I think of that all down, every down running back, fast, but not like just a blazer, good pass catcher, tough runner when he has to be. I think Trevor, I love his build. Like if I was like to dream up the build of a running back, even more so than Travis, like Trevor Etienne is like a perfectly designed running back. But I do think they have like a similar skill set and what they like to bring to the field and their athletic capability.
And the next guy we're going to talk about, again, I'm going to keep bearing the lead, but he is the guy who is probably going to be out after the season. Whereas I'm talking about, these running backs, and these guys are all young. And so do you think then, you mentioned that maybe this is how the season kind of rationally could have been expected to go for Florida. Do you think that that is where the focus of the team is for the future, considering the fact that, as I mentioned, their quarterback will probably be gone after the season?
Yeah, I mean, regardless of what happens with Anthony Richardson, be it the draft, be it the transfer portal, like whatever happens with Anthony at quarterback, this is definitely the way of the future for Florida. They are going to be a run first, run as often as they can program. You mentioned Louisiana teams like Billy Napier. That's his identity. They want to be physical. They want to assert their will. They want to throw the ball when they have to. This is not Mike Leach or even Georgia, honestly, when it comes to the passing game. They want to run the ball. They want to be physical. And I think as you see the way Florida likes to recruit, the way that Florida likes to develop players, I think that's going to be the emphasis. And then, the passing game and the receivers are kind of going to be like the X factor, the little sprinkle on top.
Yeah. So now I'll address him, Anthony Richardson. I've had my fun kind of seeing how far I can go without mentioning him, but kind of talk about, I want a temperature check on Anthony Richardson, because it was boiling to start the season after that first performance. Everyone was overreacting like crazy to that. And there were some people that were kind of saying, like slow your roll, hold, like put your foot on the brakes a little bit. This guy is basically doing everything out of structure. Let's let him do something in structure before we really react to whether or not he is a first round draft pick. And that has definitely died down a little bit. But I feel like regardless, it feels that he will probably be somewhere else next season. I want you to kind of speak on that idea, or just kind of a general temperature check of where Anthony Richardson's like hype is.
The hype with a guy who can do what Anthony Richardson can do will always be very high. Like, throw out the stats. Honestly, you can throw out the tape for the most part. His physical skill set is so silly that there's always going to be a ton of hype around him. And I don't want to be too critical, but I do think this has been kind of a disappointing season for Anthony Richardson, and the temperature check has definitely cooled off, because you just want the extra layer of consistency. Because he'll have moments, he'll have 2 to 10 plays a game that just blow your mind, and you're like, yes, this is a Josh Allen, Cam Newton level physical talent who can be, the face of the Gators, the next top 10 pick in the NFL or whatever. But he just makes so many fundamental mistakes at the same time, be it sloppy turnovers, which he has actually been a lot better at the past 2 games. I want to give him a lot of credit for that. Or missing, easy routes. And then the biggest thing for him, and it's not really his fault, is that he's just always a little bit injured. I think the first play of the game against Georgia, he got a little bit hit out of bounds. Not late, but it'll hit a little bit out of bounds. He like tweaked something in his leg. And I'm not going to speculate and say that he was playing hurt the whole game, but you could tell he wasn't fully 100% the whole time either. So, yeah, I have no idea what his future is. I don't think, if I were to pontificate and give my own opinion, I don't think he's an NFL quarterback right now. Does that mean he won't be a first-round draft pick? Absolutely not. You know how the NFL is with its toolsy athletic quarterbacks, but I think the best thing for him would probably be to come back either to Florida, or if he sees a better fit for him elsewhere in the country, then more power to him. But yeah, definitely not quite as excited or impressive as a season as I think a lot of fans would have liked.
The Anthony Richardsons of the world are definitely in phase right now in the NFL. I think if he declared he's getting drafted 100%, the question is, where does he get drafted? Because, you look at kind of how things went last season with the toolsy quarterbacks, where everyone was like, oh, they're still going to get taken in the first round, but people kind of cool down on them a little bit. But you have to assume that because there are people at the top of the class now. I think last year people were scared to be the first one to take one, whereas now there is a Bryce Young and a CJ Stroud and a Will Levis. And so I think that taking an Anthony Richardson somewhere in the day two isn't as scary as maybe it was to be the first person to pull the trigger last season. So it is interesting to see what Anthony Richardson does this year. So kind of just give a little bit of a biggest positive and biggest negative on offense this season. What would you want to see the offense as a whole, like from a macro perspective, do going forward into this game against Texas A&M?
Yeah, I think what just straight away really like the way they use their running backs in the running game and just establishing a tone and just chewing away yards and letting the young guys just make plays out of the backfield. That's like the one thing offensively that I really, really like, and I think the Gators can do a lot of success with against Texas A&M. Maybe I think pretty sure they match up well up front. Who knows? Texas A&M is kind of weird that way. I'm sure you know better than I do, but yeah, I think that's the biggest thing that I think is exciting to look forward to.
And I will say, from a person who is heavily invested into Texas A&M, I think the matchup to watch is, as you mentioned, the running game, but specifically after how Jackson Dart ate up A&M last week, how Anthony Richardson is going to do on the ground, because he was getting Cam Newton comparisons for a reason, because the physical tools are 100% there. And I think that if he so chooses, he can absolutely eat up Texas A&M on the ground. And I am honestly a little bit scared to see how that specific aspect goes, because A&M has looked like one of the worst rushing defenses in the country as of late. Now, let's kind of turn that around. Let's look at Florida's defense instead. So you mentioned it a little bit, just kind of briefly talk about, two players have been lost in the last week, Brenton Cox, who you mentioned. The other name is escaping me real quick. I can figure out who it is before
Kamara
we go.
Wilcoxon.
Yes, him. But could you just kind of speak really briefly on, the impact that losing those two players over the last week will have going forward?
Well, first with Wilcoxon, unfortunately, he was just kind of a depth player. He's a redshirt freshman, young guy. I wasn't really seeing the field as kind of like a nickel back. So Florida should be okay defending the backfield. Cox is a weird one because he's the active leader on the team in tackles for loss. He's theoretically the best pass rusher on the team, although he really hasn't produced up to his level this season. So that's definitely a loss. They have some young guys. Antoine Powell Ryland is kind of the like for like with Brenton Cox, and then like a bigger end, Princely Una Mielen. I hope I pronounced his name right. He's the other defensive end. He doesn't play the same position as Cox, but he's the other pass rusher, I would say. And he's had some games. I think the Missouri game, especially, he was fantastic disrupting the passer and getting into the backfield. So even without Cox, who's a big loss and is going to be a test to replace him, I think Florida should have enough guys to at least not be worse than they were a week ago.
Now, kind of when I was trying to do my research on Florida's defense, one thing that I thought was interesting was I really couldn't find an edge on what exactly kind of defines Florida's defense, like what they're good at, what they're bad at. So I wanted to ask you, do you think it's that Florida is really balanced defensively, or do you think it's maybe just that they're a little bit more middling?
If there's a defining characteristic of Florida's defense, it's that they are horrifically bad at getting off the field. At one point, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago. No, it was before the bye week. So I think 2 weeks ago, they were the 131st ranked defense on third down. I'm not sure if people listening know there are 131 teams at the FBS level. They were dead last, worse than Colorado, worse than Connecticut, dead last at third down defense. They've gotten a little bit better, but that's still a big weakness. But like as far as things they do well, yeah, I'd say it's kind of they have their moments in every aspect of the game. They have a decent secondary at times. At times it gets picked on. At times they have a decent run defense. At times it get picked on. So I say that's kind of they have pieces. They all interchangeably struggle. They all interchangeably thrive.
Now, kind of speak on who are the people that A&M fans should know on the Florida defense. If there's one person that comes to my mind, it's probably Gervin Dexter. He's definitely someone who I think is very interesting as a player. But who do you think should be the players that A&M fans should know that could make an impact come Saturday?
The two names, you got one of them. Two names: Gervon Dexter, the big defensive lineman. Um, he's a home wrecker. He messes things up in front. Statistically, his numbers aren't crazy, but he's also one of those future NFL lineman types who gets triple teamed every single rundown. He draws an insane amount of attention by every single opposing offensive line he faces. And then the other big one is Ventrell Miller, who is either a fifth or sixth year senior at this point. Yeah, he is one of the most veteran players in the country. When he's cooking, he is one of the best like playmaking linebackers, sideline to sideline, tackling running backs, chasing down receivers on screens, getting after a scrambling quarterback. He's the heartbeat of the defense. He's the communicator of the defense. He's the best playmaker on the defense. So he's the other guy. So Gervon Dexter up front, former 5-star defensive tackle, and then Ventrell Miller, the super senior captain, leader of the whole defense, making all the plays.
Now, I've mentioned this specific article because it's one of my favorite articles that comes out every single year. But the freaks list that the Athletic puts together every single year, I just wanted to highlight Dexter on here real quick, just because I love reading these because they're absurd. But Dexter, 6'5.5", 313 pounds, 24% body fat, squats 655, and benches 425. Truly absurd athletic numbers. Now, let's kind of go back to Florida's defense. If you had to pick a biggest positive for the defense, what do you think it is?
Biggest positive. I guess I'll keep it on the defensive front. I do like a lot of what the defensive front's doing, especially with a ton of young guys. You mentioned freaks list. Gervon Dexter's not the biggest freak on Florida's defense. Their nose tackle, Desmond Watson, I'm sure everybody at some point has seen him on Twitter, whether they know it or not. He's like 6'5", 420 pounds. He's an absolute mountain of a human. He's delightful as well. Wonderful guy. He's actually kind of become a force in the middle as well. So he's like a redshirt freshman who's really come on. Dexter's wonderful. Like all these other young guys who've played like bit parts, finally starting to see some real playing time. And I think they've played fairly well. They don't have a ton of sack or tackle for loss numbers that'll blow you away, but I just think they've been really solid at setting the tone. And I think it's just really hard to play consistently well with young guys, but I think they've kind of delivered for the most part at getting their job done, even if it's not super flashy.
And if you think Florida has to capitalize on one aspect of their defense this week on the road at Texas A&M, what do you think that they need to, whether it's like they need to capitalize on a strength or they need to fix a weakness? What do you think is the one thing that you want to see Florida capitalize on this week?
I think the biggest potential, like either advantage or just something that they can hope to do, and they kind of did this against Missouri. For all the problems with Florida's secondary, it's a fairly veteran group. It's a pretty experienced group. And I know Texas A&M has a true freshman quarterback making his first or second start. I don't know if he started last
Second.
week. His second career start in Wegman. The hope is those guys can force him into some mistakes, kind of bait him a little bit. Like Jaden Hill, he's a starting cornerback. He talked about like in the Missouri game, he just baited their quarterback and jumped on it, easy pick six. If they're guys, like the whole secondary guys who played a lot of football already, if they can, win against younger receivers and then force mistakes out of a young quarterback, I think that's kind of the leverage point. Like the best hope for them is to kind of use whatever experience they have, little mind game, study the film a little bit properly and kind of, make those veteran plays against a fairly young A&M offense.
I'm glad you mentioned Jane Hill because that's a player who I definitely meant to mention, but did not remember to bring him up to this point. Now, I will say too that that's interesting that you mentioned maybe having a very, veteran defensive back unit because A&M is trotting out a very young wide receiving core. You're looking at a guy like Evan Stewart, who's a true freshman, who's looking like one of the premier jump ball receivers in all of college football. He's really come on as of late, and I think A&M fans are most excited going forward, looking at what Wegman and what Evan Stewart can do together. Two true freshmen moving the ball down the field, and then another guy who I was praising him heading into the season. So upset that he didn't get Tick to start the year. And then it took the Nia Smith injury midway through the year for him to even see the field, really. But Moose Muhammad III, he has been basically a 100-yard or a touchdown kind of player over the last few games where you're getting one or the other. You're going to get something out of him. And that's kind of like, if you want a guy who's like your go-to receiver, you want to have something like that where it's like you're either getting yardage or you're getting a touchdown. And so I think Moose Muhammad, sophomore, he's another guy. So it's going to be interesting to see how like that kind of pairs up against each other. There's a little bit of a dichotomy there. Now let's go.
Just real quick, I don't want to like that's what scares me if I'm Florida, is that I know A&M's offense has been inconsistent and all that stuff that people talk about all the time about A&M and Jimbo Fisher, but like they have dudes. They have a lot of dudes who can make plays. And for all the praise I have for Florida's secondary and their experience, there's going to be one-on-ones that Evan Stewart and Muhammad, they're going to win. They're going to win some battles. And if Wegman is as good as he looked at times last week, A&M might get some points and they're going to get some yards. And it's going to be very interesting.
Yeah, definitely very excited for that. There's one thing you cannot say about A&M is that they don't have talent on the team. You can say whatever you want about how they've executed with the talent, but they have talent. That's the point blank period of this. Now let's kind of look at the expectations for the game. Kind of what do you think is going to be the way that things kind of go down? Do you have expectations that Florida is going to be able to do this one thing well, that A&M is going to be able to do this one thing well? Just kind of like looking at the matchup, what are your expectations for the game?
Yeah, the thing is I expect Florida to try and win in both lines of scrimmage and kind of set the tempo. I feel like they're going to try and force A&M to stop the run, make them beat you in that way. And then on the flip side, they're going to force Connor Wegman in his second career start to beat him through the air. There's probably going to be difficult coverage. I guess if I was game planning, I would try and make difficult coverage, force them to beat you through the air and force them to make you throw the ball. And that's, if they can do that, I don't know. It kind of depends on what version of Florida we get and what version of Texas A&M we get. These are not very consistent teams this year, I'd say.
I think that's what makes this game so exciting for me personally, is that I kind of don't know what to expect from either side. And so it's kind of like, oh, what is going to happen? I have no idea. But yeah, I mean, if I'm Florida, I'm definitely trying to dig deep into my defensive bag and just throw the most foreign passing defenses at Connor that I can. Just make him like second guess himself constantly, because he's a young guy. And so you want to kind of really test him out and see if that's what he like, basically be like, okay, beat me. And, if he does, then you die by it. But if he doesn't, then, you did what you could. So kind of to go into that, I like to say that I won't ever make anyone give me a score prediction because that's almost impossible to get right. But if you were to predict how the game goes down, how do you think things shoot out?
I think it's going to be a close game. I think they're two fairly, at this point in both programs, I think they're very similar in what in their overall level and their overall standing. I think Florida's sneaky good as a road team, especially when we look at like how they played at Neyland a couple of weeks ago. Just fairly good road team. So I will tentatively say I think Florida gets it done, but I'm not going to die on that take. I could absolutely say A&M winning. Maybe A&M wins by a lot. I know it's probably going to end weird if I know anything about Florida playing A&M. When they played in 2020, that game was very strange. It was a weird game. So I'm not going to predict that, but I do predict something weird's going to happen, and it's going to force like a 4-point win. Because I will give you a score prediction because I like score predictions. I'll say Florida 28, A&M 24.
I think that is probably like, I think that's a very good guess as to what the score prediction would be. Like, I think that is almost like any score that I could have asked for. A&M right now 3.5-point favorites at home, which means that, Vegas is putting them on a neutral site at basically dead even, when you account for home field advantage. So I think it's going to be a very fun game. I think this game is going to be a hard game to predict because you could very easily have one team just kind of fart around, and then the other team could also just kind of fart around. And so you could see it end up being a blowout for one side or the other, or you can just see this be, a slop fest that ends up not being very good, or maybe both teams just put it together. Like, you can really get all four phases in this game. But I honestly love that 28-26 prediction. I will also say A&M wins. I have not been good at predicting A&M wins because this team has been too unpredictable, but I will take A&M on this one. And I don't know, I really like your score prediction. I'm coming up with this on the spot. I'll say 27-24 is my score prediction. I'm almost basically where you are, but that's kind of what I'll go with. So
Yeah.
thank you for coming on this podcast with me. It was a blast to have you. Before we get out, do you want to let people know where they can find you, either where they can find your work, where they can find you on social media, etc.?
Yeah, you can follow me at Topher_Adams. And then just look for the Alligator. I believe it's alligator.org is where all of our coverage is for sports and all that good jazz. And yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It was a blast, and looking forward to a very interesting game on Saturday.
I am too. Now, make sure you guys also check out the other podcasts on the Battalion Network. That includes our news podcast, The Bat Signal, and our life and arts podcast, Calculated Culture. Thank you all for listening, and I will see you all next week for another fantastic episode of bringing on people for this cheat sheet series. Thank you.